Snow sifted like ground glass through the high blue of the Eyrie's morning, though the sky itself was pitiless and clean. Sansa stood on a gallery of white marble with her hands curled around the frozen rail, and the cold moved into her palms the way the whisper of a song moves into a heart, quietly, and then all at once. Below her, the mountain fell away in white shelves, and white gullies and white wind, softer than feather down and harder than iron. The world had been pared by frost to its hardest lines. Far off, a hawk described an idle circle in air so thin it seemed it might cut feather and bone alike. The wind gathered her hair and flung it, and the skin at the corner of her eyes stung until tears prickled. It was a good sting. It kept her here, in this moment, on this ledge of the world, instead of in the ached, echoing places where Winterfell lived in her. If she closed her eyes, she could make out the smell of old smoke and hot bread and dog fur, could hear a boy's laughter that was braver than it knew how to be, could feel the roughness of a stone the size of a table where she had once felt the sun. It was dangerous to close her eyes. She opened them and watched a single flake melt on her glove. One drop made a dark spot in the pale leather. Then the wind took it and turned it to nothing. She had been taught as a child to see omens in such tiny things. She was not a child. "My lady," said a voice behind her, careful as stepping over ice. "The Lords Declarant are within the high hall." Elaine Stone would have chided the boy for startling her. Sansa Stark inclined her head and turned, drawing the fur of her mantle closer. The boy was one of Nestor Royce's, no beard to boast of, but eyes that would not quite meet hers for long. He had learned respect with his ladders, and fear with the first winter wind. Both sat awkwardly on him. "Thank you, Harbit," she said. "Tell Maester Coleman I will sit with Lord Robert before we begin. Maester says best not to overtax the boy in cold air." Harbit's mouth pinched around the word boy. There were men in the Vale who called Robert Arryn their lord with their tongues, while calling him boy in their bones, and flinching when his hands fluttered. Sansa recognized the pinch. She had seen it on Lannister men, on City Watch, in the Red Keep's shadowed doorways. She had learned to measure derision finer than salt. "The High Hall is a draft," Sansa said. "The boy is the lord of the Eyrie and the Vale, and today is cold whether he sits in his solar or on the high seat. We will keep him warm, please." Harbit blinked, trying to reassemble the pieces of what had sounded to him like an order wrapped kindly. He nodded and hurried away, boots clipping too loud on stone that rang like a glass. Left alone again, Sansa stood long enough for the sting at the corner of her eyes to dry and flake. Then she went inward, through the low door, and along a passage that she had learned in her feet so well she could have walked it in unlit night. Past the mews where the hawks were a sibilance of leather and breath. Past the small chamber where the tapestry of the falcon and maiden hung. The maiden's eyes had faded first, then her mouth. The falcon still held its shape. She paused outside the solar. Even through the thick door, she could hear the soft tap-tap-tap of a fingernail on wood, a tick of worry and habit like a distant clock. Maester Coleman's voice murmured, coaxing, the sound a spoon makes in thin broth. When she entered, warmth pressed like a hand to her face. The braziers were heaped. Lord Robert Sweetroben still, to the nurse who had known him too long, sat curled in a chair piled with furs. A small prince in a nest, pale as a spilled bowl of milk. His hair fell in wisps to his shoulders. His hands were doing the tapping, right hand on the arm of the chair, as though reminding the chair it belonged to him. "Elaine," he said, and smiled as if he had discovered something. "I dreamed the mountain opened and there was a stair that went up and up, but when you reached the top it went up again. Then you have seen the Eyrie as it wishes to see itself," Sansa said, crossing to him. She bent to kiss his hair and smelled sweet sleep in the air, the powder's faint, bitter almond ghost. "You greet me with a smile. That is a good omen for today." "Will they make me stand?" Robert asked. He turned a little, and the tapping stopped for a heartbeat. "I don't like to stand long. My legs. In my dream." The stair had no rail, and the wind blew. "Medine, you will sit on the high seat," Sansa said, kneeling beside him so that her eyes were on a level with his. "Bronze Yohn Royce will bow, and Lady Waynwood, and Lord Redfort, and all the rest. They will swear to you, and then we will hear them. You will be very brave. You may even be bored." He giggled at that, quick and true, and reached for her hand. She let him hold it. His fingers were cold, and his palm was damp, and he squeezed in little pulses, like his heart had learned a way out. "If I am brave, may I have—" He caught his lower lip in his teeth. "May I have a falcon's feather for my hat?" "You may have two," Sansa told him, and his delight shivered through him so sweetly that her own lips twitched. Maester Coleman hovered beside the brazier, a narrow man in a narrow robe, old careful hands that had spilled more tea than blood despite the winters he had passed. His eyes went from Robert to Sansa with a mother's worry. "My lady," he said softly, "remember we discussed the draft. We will have the screens up, and we will move quickly." She rose to her feet. "I will stand by him." Coleman's mouth flattened at that. He had once told her, in one of those soft, brave confessions that old men make when sleep has worn their armor thin, that Lysa had insisted on standing by the boy always, which had been as good as standing between him and Eyrie. He had not told Sansa this to wound. It had wounded. She had thanked him all the same. "Sir Lothor will be near?" Coleman asked, as if the presence of a hard man with hard knuckles could cure a sickness of wind and blood. "The boy fears Lyn Corbray. Sir Lothor is with his lord," Sansa replied, neutral as a snowfield where a single step would make a line. "Today, Sir Michael and Sir Donal Waynwood will stand on either side of the high seat. The boy knows Sir Donal. The boy trusts Sir Donal, because Sir Donal lets him see the falcons," Robert said, with a ghost of pride. I held one on my arm. It made a sound like a cat does when it is happy. "Then we are agreed," Sansa said. "Harbit is already in the hall. Bring the boy when the screens are set, and we will make a court of it. A brisk court." Bender. She left before Coleman could press the tiny packet in his sleeve into her palm, before he could use the word tremor. The corridor's cold scrubbed away sweetness. To confess the truth to bronze and oak and stone, she needed to keep her head clear of powder and mercy alike. Beyond the solar, the Eyrie was a sound of quiet preparations. Men-at-arms checking the rivets on their harness with the flat clack of a finger. A scullion staggering with a basket of small logs for the braziers. In winter, even small logs were heavy. Two girls straightening the carpets along the great gallery so the Lord's boots would not catch. One girl with raw red knuckles, one with a pattern of white scars like a frost branch over her wrist. Sansa saw the scars but did not ask. She had learned that in the Vale scars were often only the oldest winter that had touched a body. She passed under the carved falcons of the entry to the high hall and stopped. The hall was light as a held breath. A place that had not been built so much as sifted out of sky. Pale pillars rose like the trunks of winter trees. The floor was a clean blade of white. At the far end, the high seat stood before the moon door, its iron rings and winch hidden by a tapestry today. A ridiculous pretense that made men feel safer, though they were sitting atop a hole in the world. Screens had been set along the walls to blunt the drafts, and with the braziers lit the air held a sigh of warmth, hesitant but honest. Bronzion Royce stood with his helm in his hands, and the light in the bronze scales of his armor like a low fire. He had brought his age as a standard and set it on the floor. It stood without needing to be held. Lady Anya Waynwood was beside him in deep blue wool that drank light instead of catching it, her face handsome and unsmiling, her hair bound back with a ribbon of silver. Nestor Royce, in more modest bronze, speaking quietly to Horton Redfort and Simon Templeton. Benedar Belmore fussed with his glove, pulling it on and off as if the glove knew a secret, and he meant to coax it out. Gilwood Hunter carried a switch of some mountain shrub and flicked it against his boot, not quite absent-mindedly. Lyn Corbray leaned one hip against a pillar, balancing himself with the toe of one boot, Lady Forlorn slung across his back. He was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with goodness, with a mouth made for laughter and cruelty both. And he smiled when Sansa came, as if the exact thing he had wished for had occurred, and the gods might perhaps be forgiven for all else. "My lady," Bronzion said. his voice a grindstone made civil. "We thank you for receiving us in the hall. You are brave to sit a court in this bite of a day." "Then? The day bites less when men face one another," Sansa replied. "If we all hid in our solars, winter would never end." "A stark proverb?" Lady Anya asked, as if she had already guessed the answer and found herself willing to be surprised. "It might be," Sansa said, and felt her heart lift in her chest, like a trapped thing pushing up against a lid. She had resolved that when she spoke the truth, she would not drape it in honey. But some habits could not yet be unlearned. "Today, I will speak plainly. I will ask the same of you." Nestor bowed his head, the gesture neat as a well-inked letter. "Plain speech and warm food are the gifts we pray for in winter," he said. "We will follow your lead, my lady." "My lead," Lyn Corbray echoed. He straightened from the pillar and made her a small, exact bow that mocked more than it honored. "And what title shall we give you in this hall today?" "The Lord Protector's bastard?" "The Lord Protector's lady?" "The late Lady Lysa's pet?" There was a sound then, not loud, but like a single bead of glass striking stone and breaking. A sound to gather attention. The men turned to it. Sansa did not. She had felt that particular little sting before. Once, in a hall of red and gold, it had cut her mouth. "Today," she said, "you may call me Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard and Catelyn, late of Winterfell. If any man contradicts this, he may speak now, and I will show him the inside of me as he is asking to see the inside of a man when he calls him liar. But I think there are still men in the Vale who knew my father's face, and my mother's, and my own when it was smaller." "Then see." The hall made a different sound at that. No shatter, more a shifting of weight, as if the mountain had resettled a little. Bronzion's breath went out of him slowly, a long fog. Lady Anya's mouth, which had been a narrow line, widened as if something inside her had eased a knot. Nestor Royce looked down and then up, like a scribe double-checking a figure, and Simon Templeton's eyes sharpened not with comfort, but with interest. Lyn Corbray smiled the same smile. "And what would Sansa Stark be doing in the Vale?" he asked. "Most girls of that name are dead, last I heard, or covenanted to kings. Most men who laugh in a winter storm swallow their share of snow, last I heard," Sansa said. And before the smile could split, she added, quietly, "Lord Lyn, I pray you, do not be the first to test me. I have had sharper men for tutors." He laughed then, real laughter, bright and quick and in love with how it hurt, and opened his hands as if offering her the hall like a bauble. "We are all blessed this day. Speak, Lady Sansa. Warm us with your plainness." Then so. She did not look at the tapestry that hid the moon door. She kept her eyes on Bronzion's armor, on the diffuse fires that lived there. "We are gathered," she said, "because the Vale cannot be ruled by a man who threw its lady from that door to the coal. We are gathered because the Lord Protector speaks honey and eats blood. We are gathered because the boy who sits the high seat was being starved of air by those who professed to love him. And because truth, if you leave it in the wind long enough, will freeze and fall and be lost." Then, the quiet was not emptiness. It was the hush before a hawk drops. Sansa lifted her chin and let the quiet live until it had looked into a few men's faces and made itself at home. "Peter Baelish killed Lysa Tully Arryn," she said. "He pushed her and watched her fall. He held me after and told me that all would be well, and then he taught me how to lie for him. I have lied for him in this hall. I will not lie for him again." "Bender, my lady," Nestor said at once, while Bronzion's hand tightened on his helm, while Lady Anya's eyes closed and opened with the grave decorum of a prayer. "This is a most grievous—" "It is," Sansa said. "I have the grief of it. I bear it. There is worse. The singer Marillion was made to confess to the deed, to save Lord Petyr and me. He was beaten and kept in a cold room and told he would be loved if he said it. He said it. He is still alive. He will speak, if asked the right way and given the right mercy. Maester Coleman knows of the sweet sleep. He'll tell you that he begged to dose the boy less, and was met with tears and commands. He will tell you that in these last weeks, the powder has been kept lower, and the boy breathes more easily. He will tell you his palms shake when he remembers who it was that insisted on a heavy hand. Demshao. Coleman was not in the hall. She had not wished to make him stand beside her with his old hands like paper and say his piece. But his shadow came with her. Lady Anya took one step forward. Why? She asked. Not to Sansa. To the air. To the tapestry. To the floor. Why would a man? Why Lysa? Because no one stands between a man like Petyr Baelish and the thing he wants, Sansa said. Because Lysa had served his wanting as far as she might. Because he wished for the Vale and for me. Because in the Red Keep he would whisper beneath voices and step around blood as if it were spilled wine, humming a song only he could hear. He thought it would drown us all. He thought it would drown us all. Simon Templeton's fingers flickered like a sparrow's heartbeat. And what does my lady want? He asked, and his voice made want a clean thing and not at all different from need. Sansa let herself breathe in. Slow and careful, the way she would breathe before stepping onto the narrow stone with nothing but sky to either side. Bread first, she said. Firewood.t. Men to hold the bloody gate and not take bribes from smugglers who would sell our oats away when the passes choke. A little boy to live long enough to learn to be a man with a temper for wind, but not for powder. A court to settle their brangles without their swords. A Vale that waits until winter has shown its teeth before it chooses a war to feed. And a chair at the foot of the high seat for myself, until the boy is ready to sleep without waking at the wind's noise. Bemshao. The regency, Lady Anya said. And guardianship of the Lord Robert. Yes, Sansa said. There it was. She had thought the word guardianship would scald her tongue for the memory the word carried. Of a woman's hands clutching at her sleeve while the snow flurried and the sky spilled itself open. It did not scald. It sat like a warm stone in her mouth. If not I, then find a Vale lord who never wanted this seat for himself. Find me a man immune to the song Lord Baelish sang. If you cannot, then take me. Bronze Yon's voice came thick as bark. I knew your father, he said. He stayed in my hall on his way to Gulltown once. He had a manner of sitting as if he feared to break the chair, and I thought him strange then, a Northman in a southern seat. But when he spoke he had no songs in him at all. Only the wood of a man and the grain in the wood. His eyes went like coals to Lynn. Sir Lynn? Corbray's smile hooked at one side. I knew Lord Eddard less well than you did, Bronze Yon. Nearly not at all. He was a careful enemy, and made other men look virtuous by standing near them. Does the lady have proof for her pretty speech? Will we drag the singer in here to tremble and bleed? Will we lay hands on our Lord Protector to test how far his honor stretches? Careful, Lord Royce, careful. My love for Lord Petyr is as thin as the wind and as constant. But if you make this a matter of steel, I will crack someone like a nut and laugh while I eat him. Nemdasao. There will be no steel, Lady Anya said sharply, so that her voice rang and a hawk in the mews beyond answered without knowing why. We will have men and words. You have had your laugh and your little threat. It smells when you threaten, Lynn. Take a bath in snow. Nestor's glance darted to Sansa. You offer to sit as regent, he said, and to govern on behalf of the boy. Will you swear to forswear all claim to the Eyrie when the boy is of age? Will you swear to seek no marriage without our counsel while you sit in his name? Will you swear to keep the Vale's swords sheathed until the Council of Lords declares a cause common? Sansa let the question strike and pass like sleet. She had thought them through, until she could have sung them in her sleep. I will swear, she said, and I will swear to account for every bushel of oats we eat and every stick we burn. I will swear to keep Maester Coleman as the boy's physician, and to set watchers who are not in debt to Lord Baelish's gold at every post that matters. I will swear to pay the clans beyond the bloody gate in salt and iron to bring us word of smugglers. They do not sell their eyes for copper as some knights do. I will swear to keep the hall open 3 days a week to hear small pleas, even in snow. Bah! You speak as if you have already been ruling, Simon said. It sounded more like admiration than accusation. Sansa met his gaze. "Do I?" "Then Lord Baelish taught me more than I knew. He taught me to take the shapes of things and make them look like other things. He did not teach me the taste of honesty. That I learned from my father and my mother." The words were starting to shake under their own weight. She gentled them. "Call for Lord Petyr. Call for Marillion. Call for Maester Coleman if you wish. Set them all here under these white arches, and we will settle it between the braziers. The boy should sit as well. He should see the house that claims to love him take its care where men can watch." "Now." Lothar Brun's voice came from the door at Sansa's back, flat as a bench plank. "You'll not be dragging Lord Petyr before a mob like a cutpurse," he said. She did not turn. She knew the sound of the man's boots. She had measured the swing of his hands. "No," she said. "We will drag Lord Petyr before his peers, and ask that he answer as a peer. That is kinder than some men would wish to be." Lothar snorted. Kindness. The word was a weight too light for him to lift without making sport of it. "I've seen kindness knock men's teeth loose." Sansa turned then. Petyr Baelish stood at Lothar's shoulder with the look of mild surprise on his face that he wore like a jeweled pin at court, an ornament picked fresh each morning. Snow dusted the shoulders of his cloak as if he had just stepped in from the true winter, and his eyes when they went to Sansa were a green that had warmed 100 girls' blood and then let it cool again. "My lords," he said, his voice the little caress of a glove, "and my lady, it is a brave thing to call the wind into the hall and bid it sit. Alas, wind is faithless. It does not heed summoning, nor keep its seat. And we have so much to do to make the gates of the moon ready for the household's descent. My lady, perhaps we might—" "Lord Petyr," Bronzeyon said, with all the iron and bronze and winter bark he had saved up for all the years since he had first learned what it meant to sit a chair. "You are called to answer the charge that you murdered Lysa Tully, Arryn your wife, by throwing her through the moon door." The little crow's feet at the corner of Petyr's eyes deepened, as if the news both grieved and amused him. "I am," he said gently, "called to answer many things. I have made it my trade to be called. The moon door is a more dramatic tool than some, I grant you. But surely we do not, on such a day with the passes fretting and the stores needing count. Surely we do not mean to." "You will answer," Lady Anya said. She did not raise her voice. The hall hushed to hear the difference in her not raising it. "You will answer now." He sighed then sweetly, as if they had laid a hand on his shoulder, and he did not wish to shrug it off. "Very well," he said. "We will make a little play of it for the boy." His eyes cut to Sansa. Green, warmer, warmer, promising to burn, and cut away again. "Bring the singer," he told Lothar. "Bring Maester Coleman, Darroch, and have someone tell the kitchen that we will do with a stew of beans and bacon at noon. I should not like the lords to think me an untidy host." And now, when Lothar had gone, when the men had shifted, and the braziers breathed and Sansa counted the beats of her own heart, as if they were steps on the stair, Petyr Baelish walked to a place where the light from a high window fell clean and made his face into something even prettier than it was already, and smiled like a father at a small child making his first brave complaint. He bowed to Bronzeyon, and to Anya, and to the rest. Then he bowed last to Sansa Stark, very low, as a courtier bows to a queen in a mask, making a show of humility so extravagant it becomes pride again. She watched him rise with his face in her mouth like a poor taste. Robert Arryn came into the hall between Sir Michael and Sir Donal Waynwood. A screen had been interposed between his chair and the draught. Someone had had the sense to set flowers in a small pot on the chair's arm. The last stiff remnants of blue gentian, taken from some sun shelf, and now trying their best at courtliness. The boy's eyes went big at the sight of so many men, and then found Sansa, and then steadied. "You will sit," she told him, moving to the chair's side and making small place for herself behind it. "You will be brave, and you will be bored." "I will be bored," he whispered, as if it were a wonderful battle cry, and sat straight with his hands flat to keep them still. Marillion was brought, and his hair had been hacked off, and his eyes were full of runes and iron. Maester Coleman came and would have gone to the boy at once, but Sansa lifted 2 fingers, and the old man folded his hands and put them in his sleeves and stood beside Lady Anya as if he had always meant to be there. Lothar Brune leaned against a pillar near Petyr Baelish and pretended he had slept well. Petyr began as Sansa had known he would, with the soft confession of grief and the laid-out story of a woman sick in her mind, and a singer coaxed to sickness of his own by wine and vanity, with witnesses and little details that made a lie look at its loveliest. Marillion wept and agreed when it was time to agree. Men shifted their feet and looked at the floor. The stew of beans and bacon was like a promise in the air for noon. Then Lady Anya stepped forward and asked Coleman some questions in the tone of a woman choosing fabric. Nothing at all to do with blood, only weight and arm's length, and whether the thing would hold warmth against a winter. How much sweet sleep had the boy been given in the last month? How much before? Who had ordered more? Who had stayed the maester's hand? For how many nights had the boy slept fearlessly? A man might forget how to count. She mused, if he were crying. Coleman answered because he could not do otherwise, and because the old have less shame than the rest, if you let them keep their kindness. He wept once, very small, and then made himself dry on a corner of his sleeve, as if he were a very neat child. When he was done, Nestor Royce asked him to repeat the very first numbers, very slowly, and Coleman did, and those numbers came out the same. Men looked up from the floor. Simon Templeton went to Marillion as a priest might, and told him he would be given bread and tea and a bed in a warm room if he would speak truly. And the singer's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and the words started to come out of him, not like a confession, but like vomiting. Petyr's hand moved once, and Lothar's hand moved to his sword just enough to let men see it move. And Lady Anya said without lifting her voice that if Lothar Brune drew steel in the high hall, she would see him thrown out the moon door wrapped in silk, like a package to make the gods smile at our foolish ways. And Lothar stood very still. Bronze-Jan asked Sansa then to tell what she had seen. She told them. She did not dress the scene. She did not add tears to sweeten the story. She told of Lysa's hands on her arms and of the sky being not a sky at all but a mouth, and of Lord Petyr's hand on her shoulder afterwards, warm as if he were comforting her and heavy as a man's hand draped over a purse to warn the street. She told them that she had lied. She told them that she did not wish to lie again. Petyr Baelish listened as if listening were its own art, and he a master of it. When she had done, he let 3 breaths pass, elegant as steps in a dance. Then he said, almost regretfully, "My lady is a child. Since King's Landing, she has been forced to learn games no child should learn, and she has learned them badly. I am tearsick for her. If I have erred, it has been in thinking that a father's care and a man's prudence were not different things. I regret any harm that has come. I do not accept that I have caused it." "Bah! Lord Petyr," said Lady Anya, with the precise weariness of someone correcting the same mistake in a clever pupil for the 3rd time. "You do not regret your own hand. Does any man here believe that had the Lady Lysa not been forced, she would have flown? No? Then we will proceed. Marine?" Lyn Corbray's tongue touched his lip, as if he could taste the air thickening. His eyes glittered because glittering well is a skill. Sansa met his gaze and did not drop it. She had learned to do that from a queen who had wanted her dead and had taught her much of living instead. The rest came not like a ending but like a beginning. Clumsy at first, and then cleaner as men found roles to play that did not require steel. The lords declared together that Petyr Baelish was to be confined in his apartments pending judgment at the gates of the moon, where all the lesser lords might attend and hear and add their voices, and that he was relieved of his office as protector for the present. Lothar Brune was to surrender his sword and remain under guard, as a guest and not a prisoner, which meant that no man would choose to make him a prisoner lest the words men spoke become brittle when it was time to say them again. Marillion was to be given a blanket and a room with a window high enough to let in light and too high to leap through, and tea and bread, and no one was to touch him to teach him how to speak. Maester Coleman was to keep the boy, and sweet sleep was to be put by, and the boy was to be walked every day between the braziers, so his legs would harden, and his lungs recall their work. And the lady? Simon Templeton said, when the lords had put down their words like stones to make a safe crossing. And the seat at the foot of the high seat? Bronzion's lip twitched under his beard. We will have a council of 6 lords to sit by the regent, he said. Lady Waynwood, Lord Nestor, Lord Redfort, Lord Belmore, Lord Hunter, and myself. The lady will be regent in fact, and we in council. And she will bring to us the counts of bread and sticks and men, and we will bring to her the grudges of our vassals and the names of smugglers who suddenly find their throats dry. She will swear, and so will we. Lady Anya's eyebrow lifted by a hair. And if we write it, we must keep it, she said, or else we will be scribes and not lords. Write it, Sansa said. Give me a pen now, and I will write it with you. My hand is neat. My mother taught me to set my letters as if they were guests at a table. Petter's voice came quiet then. I remember that hand, he said. It wrote a song once and put it in a window, and a boy climbed that window and cut his hands for love of what the hand had written. Ah. Sansa, you have become an excellent pupil. She did not look at him. Men were gathering to him. Not friends, not enemies either yet, but men with the instinct to know where dinner will be served. He let them close, and smiled, and was gentle, and made little jokes as they led him to his apartments. And if shafts of bitter weather found their way into those rooms while he was confined there, if the rushes found small knives in their corners, if the hearth smoked, who would call it malice? Winter is a clumsy servant. When it was done, when Robert had sat his hour and been bored and brave, when the proclamations had been read out with enough pomp to warm cold blood, when the first of the scribes had been set to their task with charcoal and a board because ink grew sluggish in this air, Sansa left the hall by the eastern door into a corridor colder than the world, and found the narrow stair she wanted, and went up until the wind went through her, and the sky felt very nigh and very distant all at way. The ledge was not large. She had no wish to fall. She pressed her back to stone and breathed smoke and ice, and something like the first hint of thaw that only the very high places feel, because they are too near the sky to be as dead as the low places in winter. Maya Stone found her there because Maya found everyone, sooner or later, if they tried to pretend that a place where the mountain crumbles into cloud could keep a secret. Maya carried a coil of line on one shoulder and had her hair tied back with a strip of leather that was stained from old sweat and sun. She grinned when she saw Sansa and then sobered, because grinning was a luxury. You did it, she said, or part of it. Is there more? There is always more, Sansa said. Thank you for the screens in the hall. The screens, Maya said, as if the word amused her. I was thinking of what the wind thinks of screens, but the boy sat. He looked like a falcon chick trying to make his neck be a neck. He was brave, Sansa said, and bored. Maya's grin came and went. Everyone's brave when they're bored. The gates of the moon are ready enough to take us. The storemen grumble at counting as they do. The mule teams are restless. They don't like the air up here now. And there's a man at the bloody gate with a way of making coin smell like church incense. Nestor will break him or make him rich, depending how friendly Nestor is feeling. Men so. Find out which man it is, Sansa said. Find out who sells him sanctity. Bring me the name in writing and a second name that you think is tricking us into thinking he is the one. The smugglers will be moving while the passes still pretend to be roads, and send word to the high road watchers that they are to take, and to pay clan men for news. Maya nodded. She took a great deal of satisfaction in instructions that were not soft as snow. You'll have men say you're paying mountain wolves to stand at your door, she said. I am, Sansa answered. Wolves are honest about what they take. Are you pleased, Maya? Pleased, Maya said, is for when a mule doesn't kick and a winch doesn't jam and a lord looks at you and sees a person instead of another winch. I'm, she considered, not slow but thorough. I'm glad to see a lady who learned the mountain quick. There's mostly only two sorts of women up here. Ones who think the mountain is a story, and ones who think the story is about them. You don't seem to think either. That's good. The mountain hates both sorts. Nah. It hates praise, Sansa said. It hates songs. Maya laughed. Short and easy. Then don't sing it a song. Sing it a count. How many men and mules and bags of oats? How many boots? How many days until the passes choke? I will. Sansa looked past Maya to a sky that seemed to hold more blue than any world should. And I will send for Lord Harold Harding, quietly. It will be well if he comes to the gates of the moon to meet his cousin, the Lord, while the passes allow. I would like to see the shape of him before all the Vale puts its hope on his shoulders. The boy with the jaw, Maya said with an uncharitable fairness. He rides too hard and uses the same words on every girl. The girls like this until they don't. I'll send word, and I'll have my men at the winch keep an eye to the Lord Protector's windows. Men don't like to be pinned. The ones who smile dislike it the most. When Maya had gone, Sansa stayed with the wind. It made a sound like a quiet sea, but there was no salt here. No soft blunting. It was a clean sound that polished you. She let it move through her until the last of her fear rattled like dry leaves, and was done rattling. Then she went back to the hall to see to the stew, and the parchment, and the boy, and the men whose grudges came like a snowfall. Quiet, particular, endless, and to make of them something that would hold against the cold. For 3 days they sat, and 3 nights, and the lists began to fill their nails, and then their knuckles, and then their wrists. Every count gave birth to 2 others. Every promise asked to be given a chair of its own. Sansa learned which men grew loud when their bellies were empty, and made sure to feed them. She learned which men were mean when they drank, and made sure the wine was watered. She made a place by the fire for Simon Templeton at dusk, and asked him for old stories of the narrow sea, because men with stories forget for a while that their fingers itching for coin is the only story they know. She found a place for Nestor's parchment that did not curl in the draft. She praised Benedar Belmore for his neat hand, when he had a neat hand, and ignored the rest. She stood behind the high seat and laid her fingers lightly on the wood. When Robert curled in on himself and breathed too shallow for 3 breaths running, and she counted those breaths and the breath of the braziers, and hers, and Coleman's, and when she had counted 10, she felt the boy's breath steady. At night, in the rooms that had had Lysa in them, and then Eyre and then Sansa, she let herself sit and be very quiet. The tapestries here were of falcons and maidens and mountains that looked nothing like the mountain they were supposed to be. Someone had stitched the snow too soft. Sansa looked at the bad snow until the stitches blurred and then sharpened, and then she went to the small table and wrote lists in a neat hand. Grain stores at the gates of the moon confirmed and rumored. Cellars at the Eyrie down to the last heel of cheese and cabbage barrel. Mules strong enough to work the winches daily. Carpenters, blacksmiths, men with stoves that could be moved and men who knew how to set them without burning down the huliha. Names beside each. A mark by those who had a wife who scraped her pots too clean because she had learned what hunger asked and would not forget to leave a little fat for winter tongues. Another mark by those who gambled and always almost won. She considered letters north, then put the consideration away like a ribbon in a chest. What would she say? To whom? If she wrote to White Harbor, she could write to a man who smiled with every tooth but showed what was behind them, only when the table was cleared. If she wrote to the wall, it would be to air and ice and men she did not know. If she wrote to the Riverlands, she would be writing to a country that bled when it breathed. So she wrote instead to the keepers of the salt pans on the little lakes of the Vale, and asked them if the brine took longer to boil in this cold, and whether wood was best, or peat, or dung. She wrote to the small sept near the bloody gate, whose prior knew the ways of travelers, and asked him to bless the passes, and give her the names of 2 men who would not sell a blessing for copper. On the fourth morning, the sky dropped a different kind of snow. Fat flakes that came from a sky gone the color of pewter, falling straight down as if heavy with an intent to settle. Sansa stood again on the white gallery and watched it, and thought of bread under a cloth, still warm, and of a letter that had sat in a window once, and of girls who had sung songs that meant something in songs that meant nothing, and how it was easy to confuse them when you were cold and hungry for music. Harold Harding came after that, with 24 men and a lovely boy's arrogance, and a jaw that looked cut with a careful knife. He wore a plume and laughed too quick, and tried to kiss Sansa's hand with his mouth too warm. She did not let him, and smiled in a way that made him step back 1/2 step, and then forward again, because stepping back felt like an insult to himself. "Cousin," he said to Robert in the hall, with an easy sweetness that made women like him and men wary. "You grow more a lord every day." Robert stared at him, then at Sansa, then nodded, and then, because he had remembered a line Sansa had given him, he said, "I am bored." Harold's laugh had a brief honesty to it then, brighter than the practiced one. "I know the feeling," he said, and Lady Anya's mouth tightened by a fingernail's width. Sansa walked with him later along the great gallery, where the tapestry of the maiden and falcon hung, and asked him what songs he liked and why. He liked songs of victory, he said, and songs where the girl said no, and then yes, because she had been taught that no was the first part of yes. Sansa listened. She did not tell him he had chosen badly. He would only have grown charming to defend his choices. She asked him what he had brought from his own seat of greenstone, and he told her about cheeses, and she asked him the names of the wives of the men who had made the cheeses, and he blinked, and then remembered two, and then a third came to him when he had not expected it, and he seemed pleased at himself for knowing it. At supper he sat with Bronjean and told a story about a horse no one could ride except him, and Sansa watched the way he watched himself telling it. Boys who watched themselves could be made to watch their lords. Boys who never watched themselves could not be taught. She asked him, before the meal was done, if he had ever taken a hawk when the wind was wrong on purpose to learn what wrong felt like in his arm. He laughed and said he had never done anything on purpose that was wrong. Later, Maya told her he had taken 3 hawks in the wrong wind and injured only one. Sansa did not know if she was pleased or only relieved. That night, a messenger came with a letter sealed with yellow wax from Gulltown, a tidy hand telling of a ship lost, and 2 ships found, and a price on barley that was no longer a price but a joke. She read it and wrote back, and put the letter in the coffer where she kept the lists. And when she closed the lid, she saw in the polished wood not her face, but a girl's face that watched the girl it pretended to be with new caution. The 5th morning dawned with a wind that had changed its mind, and came nosing up the mountain from the sea, damp and making the snow into a different thing. The braziers smoked, and the tapestry smelled of old wool and old smoke. Sansa stood in the high hall, and told the man from Ironwax that he would not take a cart past the bloody gate with 4 barrels of salted fish when the pass was thin, and other men carried oats that would feed more mouths. He grew red and said fish fed too. She asked him how many mouths he meant, and he counted and named, and came up with a number that became smaller when Simon Templeton asked him very gently if his counters had teeth. When he was done, he took off his cap and folded it, and put it in his hands as if now that the cap had been taken, the humility had somewhere to sit. In the afternoon, she found Robert standing in the corridor outside his solar with no cloak, and his hair stuck to his forehead and his chest moving too quick. Sir Donal had one hand on the boy's shoulder, but his eyes were white around the edges from wanting to run for Coleman. Sansa went to the boy and put her own body between him and the wind, and counted with him, and told him a story under her breath about a snowflake that wanted to be a star. And the boy's breathing came right not because the story was good, but because her own breath was slow and his body remembered how to borrow it. "Am I brave?" he asked when the world had settled back into its place. "You are brave," she said. "And bored." He smiled and put his cold hand to her cheek. He stood close enough that she could smell his child's smell, the milk of him and the ink. "Will you always stand by me?" he asked. "Yes," Sansa said, and found she had said it already in the hall to all the men, and that saying it here was the same promise and a different one. Yes. She dreamed that night of Winterfell, and in the dream the meat came not in trencher cuts but in cold slices, because the kitchens had counted wrong and made too much, and the next day was feast day again. In the dream, she could not tell if that had been mercy or waste. She woke and found her palm had a line in it that looked like a road over mountains. She burned a little sweet pine in the brazier and smelled the resin, and thought of men who made their living by scraping sap and selling the smell of it for half a loaf. She went to her table and wrote a letter to the men in the pines, asking what they would take for a cartload of resin. Then she wrote a note to Maya to send a man she trusted with the letter. Then she blew out the candle and sat in the dark until the cold made it time to lie down. When she lay down, she did not cry. There was too much to do. When the order came down from the high hall that Petyr Baelish would be removed from his apartments and taken to the gates of the moon under guard, Lothar Brune stood very straight and smiled as if he approved of a jest whose knife did not show. Petyr dressed as if for a journey through a city and not a descent, in a wine-dark cloak edged with gray. He asked if Sansa would walk to the head of the stair with him. Men made to forbid it and then waited because they wanted to see what would be said. They walked, and the stair was narrow, and the air came in long knives that nicked skin without drawing blood. At the head of the first flight, where the mountain opened itself as if remembering it was a sea once, Petyr stopped and put his hand to the rail, the way a man does when he is about to say something that will make him feel larger. His breath smoked and drifted away. "You have a talent I did not expect," he said. "It excites me." "Your excitements do not interest me," Sansa said. She did not put a hand to the rail. "Your departures do." He smiled that small smile that was made to seem private even in a crowd. "Ah, Sansa," he murmured, "I made you. Do not pretend you are shy of names. If you wish me to give you another, I had a name when you found me." She said, "You painted another over it with a pretty brush. You spilled a woman through a hole and told me to sing your song. Do not be surprised that a Stark child knows how to sand paint down to wood." He looked at her then in a new way. Not with anger, not yet, but with interest broken of its habit of warmth. "He will die," he said, almost kindly. "Your boy. He will die of a fit, or of too much wind in his chest, or of the wrong wind. Then the jaw will be lord. Then you will wish to have me back, because jaw boys are very fond of their jaws, and not very fond of a lady who has kept house without them. You will cry over my absence the way widows cry over the husbands who beat them. It is a sort of faithful crying." "If he dies," Sansa said, and the words were flat as a knuckle, "I will have done all for him that I could, and I will have done it without draining his blood by mouth and calling it love, and I will not cry for you." "Then, don't," he said. He stepped onto the stair. "Cry for yourself. It will make better songs." He went down then, and his cloak caught the wind and filled, and then flattened, and men moved in careful steps, and the mountain breathed, and Sansa stood and did not touch the rail, and counted the beats of her heart until the men were small and the wind was larger than all of them. At the gates of the moon the world was warmer and dirtier. Snow there turned to a brownish slush, and then water that made puddles like stains. The gates themselves had an old beauty that liked to be overlooked. They had been made by men with good backs and old pride. Sansa had always found something comforting in them. They took the household with its lists and its bones and its bustle, and made it into a thing that fit the land again. Men became not so much voices and oaths as hands and work. She walked the storehouses with Nestor Royce, who liked to talk while he counted, because for him the counting made its own prayer. He ran his hands along the sacks like a man who loved cloth, and found he loved burlap after all. He spoke of men who would cheat and how, and of men who would not, and why. She listened and made her marks. She met with the carters and told them they would be paid if they did not ride the passes when they should not. And one of them cried, a grown man, because he had been thinking to risk his wife's winter for a little silver. She put her hands on his hands and felt the winter's work in them. The work reminded her of hands from the north, and she did not pull away. She sent envoys to the Sept and to the Godswood at Redford, for not all the Vale had forgotten the old trees, and she told each that if they would pray, they should pray for patience most, because starving men had little patience, and patient men ate smaller portions, without letting their tongues gall. The Septon wanted coin, and the godswood wanted silence. She gave both and learned which was harder to obtain in winter. She called Maya and asked which of the clans nearest the high road would be most amenable to trade for iron. And Maya hemmed and hawed and named two, and then came back an hour later with a third name on her tongue, and the reason she had added it. The new chieftain of that clan had a wife who had only recently learned to read numbers carved into sticks, and such women often made their men keep their bargains because numbers pleased them. Sansa wrote the name and the note about the wife in the margin, and put a star by it. And Maya saw the star and grinned, and then hid the grin the way you hide a candle when the draught threatens it. Letters came from the Riverlands, cautious as foxes in daylight. One, from a minor Lady Frey whose name Sansa read twice and forgot between readings, asking whether the Vale would buy wheat that was half chaff. Another from a man calling himself Castellan of Raventree for the Brackens, offering to sell arrows and men to shoot them. Sansa answered both politely and bought nothing, but she wrote down the dates and the names and had Simon Templeton read the letters aloud to her 3 times until the sound of the voices behind the hands began to show. She sent a letter to White Harbor, addressed to a man she had never met, who was rumored to laugh at his enemies and laugh with his friends and eat when both were hungry, and asked what the sea looked like in winter from that city wall. She sealed the letter and did not expect an answer, and did not need one. Sometimes asking was the act, not the reply. At dusk on the 7th day, with Petter Baelish 3 days gone, and the lists long enough to be bound, and the boy's cough less knife-edged than it had been, Sansa stood in the small chamber off the kitchens that the cooks called the Worm Parlor, and sipped a cup of bone broth that tasted better than it had any right to taste. The door opened, and Lady Anya came in and sat without asking, as queens sit in rooms not theirs and make them theirs. "You have done what you said you would," Lady Anya said. "So far, so far." Sansa agreed. She took another sip. The broth had a little fat on it, and she felt the fat soothe the sore inside her mouth where she had bitten it in the hall. "He will send," Lady Anya said, "from his cell and from his friends' houses. He will sing, for he is a singer. He will sing of your lies and of your cold and of how you love a boy so much that you mean to smother him with your care. He will sing of the stark girl who thinks her name is a fire to warm us all. He will make the sort of men who prefer songs to bread cry for him. He may even persuade a few who know better to pretend to be persuaded." "I know," Sansa said. "Do you?" Lady Anya's eyes were very clear in the lamp's weak light. "Do you know what it is to be the woman whose hands men look at for their bread until they tell themselves those hands are greedy? That woman must wear her rings lightly." "I do not wear rings," Sansa said, and made herself smile just enough. "They catch on sacks." Lady Anya's mouth twitched. "That too," she said. She looked at the cup in Sansa's hands. "You will need men, not only for the passes and the gates, for your chair. Men who are not afraid of being seen to eat your bread and call it good. Find them, and find women. Women who can count better than their husbands, and who will forgive you for being young. You have the advantage of not thinking yourself beautiful enough to make women hate you for the wrong reasons. Besham, I have learned something of women in rooms." Sansa said. "King's Landing teaches that lesson, if nothing else. The women who hated me for my songs grew thin in winter. The women who listened to my counting kept their meat a little longer." "And you?" Lady Anya asked, and it was not a kind question, nor an unkind one. "Which are you?" "Hungry," Sansa said simply. "But I know how to cut thin." Lady Anya nodded once. "Then, cut. I will stand behind you when men say you cut too thin, and in front of you when they raise a hand. Bronzion will be the stone that does not move. Nestor will be the pen. Simon will be the tongue that licks the honey off the spoon before he gives it to you. The rest are weather, and weather changes. Keep walking. Do not let the mountain make you think it is a god. It is stone and wind. neither loves you. They do not mean you harm. They do not mean you at all. Ben?" When Lady Anya was gone, Sansa finished her broth and let the cup warm her hands. In the kitchen beyond, the cooks moved like a slow dance. Ladle, turn, lay bread on the board, taste, curse, laugh, scold. She watched them through the crack in the door and thought that most of ruling was kitchen work but colder, and without the comfort of steam. Then she went to the boy and read to him from a book of falcons, while he drifted and woke and drifted again. He asked her what the wind's name was. She told him it had a dozen, and that none were real, and that if he liked, he could give it one of his own. He decided on feather, and she said that was as good as any, and better than most. Long after midnight, when the lamps were pools of honey, and the corridors had shrunk to the size of a man's breath, Sansa walked alone to the open court at the center of the gates of the moon, and stood where snow came down slow and straight. She held out her hand and watched the flakes land, and die and land, and live for a heartbeat more. The mountain loomed above, a dark thought you could not quite put aside in sleep. Somewhere up at the Eyrie, the moon door lay quiet behind its tapestry like a mouth behind a hand. She closed her eyes and saw Lysa's hair, and then she opened them because she had learned not to stand inside a picture when the world asked for her outside. A guardsman coughed by the door and then pretended he had not. Sansa turned her head and said, "Cold night." And he said, "Colder before dawn?" And she said, "Then we must make sure the fires are banked high." And he nodded as if she had told him something wise. When dawn did come, it came in thin and uncertain, as if it had doubts about the day. Sansa rose from a sleep that had been more a truce, and she set her feet on the floor and felt the cold shoot up through her bones like lightning through a tree. She stood with it until the sting turned to sharpness, and the sharpness to clarity. Then she called for water and bread and a slice of cheese for the boy and her. And when the food came, she made Robert eat while she ate, and they counted the bites, and he liked that. And when the food was done, she told him a secret. It was a small secret and not of kings. When you have to do something hard, place your hand on the wood of the thing you mean to lift and feel how solid it is. Wood lent courage. Stone did, sometimes, but it did not give it back when you were done. Wood did. He put his palm to the arm of his chair and smiled and said, "Solid." And she thought that was as good a beginning as any. She had 5 lists to add to, and a 6th to start, and a messenger to send to the place in the pines, and a letter to frame to a lord in the north she had never met and who might be dead. She had to ask Maya how quickly a mule team could be turned around if the winches froze half their iron. She had to find out which woman in the kitchens remembered how to stretch oats with turnip and make men thank her for it. She had to choose a seal for the Regency Council's parchment that would not make the men who loved hawks think she thought the hawk was hers. She did not yet know what she would do when a raven came with winter news of wars that other men thought must be the Vale's wars. That was a story for another morning, and there would be many. She knew this morning's work. She bent to it. By noon, the hall smelled of stew and damp wool and ink, and the relief of men who had been given something definite to be angry at. By evening, the braziers banked a steady heat, and the tapestries hung quiet, and Robert slept with his mouth open and his hand on the wood. The wind prowled the corridors and could not get in everywhere it wanted. This vexed it, and it made a sound like cloth being torn very slowly and very far away. Sansa stood alone again beneath the long narrow window in the high gallery, and watched that last thin light before night, the light that cuts edges into the world and shows you what is sharp and what is soft, and how both are necessary. Across the snow, 2 figures were walking, the gait of Bronzion and the shorter stride of Nestor. Their breath smoked. They were talking about lists or swords, or both, because men cannot keep swords far from their lists and lists far from their swords. She loved them both for walking in the cold and talking of both. You will be bored. She had told the boy. The words came back to her like warmth. Boredom was safety's close cousin in winter. She did not mind if they were cousins to her for a while. She placed her hand on the stone of the window, cold as truth, and on the wood of the frame, warm as keeping, and stood between them until the last of the day went, and night slipped in, not like a thief, but like a promise kept. Okay. The first hour after dawn was always the cleanest. Before the stew boiled and the ink loosened, and the men warmed their tongues, the air around the gates of the moon had a pinched honesty to it, as if the mountain were holding its breath to see what the small creature at its knees would do next. Sansa used those hours the way a careful woman uses the first heat of a new oven, testing, listening, putting in what could bear the shock. She began that morning with women, as Lady Anya had advised. They met not in the high hall, where men's voices climbed like smoke, but in the long, low room off the kitchens where the breads cooled, and the air was always animal warm. She had asked for 3 to start. Marta, who kept the mill at the ford, and had hands the color of dark bread. Leanne, a hunter's wife from Longbow Hall, with a head for weights and a mouth that stayed shut when other mouths pulled at it. And old Walena, whose back was bent, but whose tally sticks were stories in themselves, and who could shame a careless steward with one dry look. The fourth came uninvited, a silent sister with her gray veil pinned neat as a seal. Sansa had not called her, but when the woman came and folded her hands and made her quiet presence a mark on the ledger, Sansa inclined her head and found a stool. "There's a way," Sansa said without ceremony. Courtesy wasted warm air, and these women had work already waiting in their fingers. That grain disappears without the gods ever having tasted it. It is not always theft. Mice can steal as well as men. A damp bin is a thief. A careless man with a scoop is worse than both. I want to know where our losses are honest and where they are not. Can you tell me that without making too many men hate me at once? Damn. Marta's brown, flour-dusted thumb traced the grain of the table. "Some men take offense like the first taste of salt," she said. "You mean to make them swallow a sea? Better to teach them to like the taste at the edges of their bread first." "How?" "Start with the small sacks," Leanne said. "The eyes notice the great barrels. They don't notice the small sacks. Count those twice. Make the men who take the sacks sign their names when they go and when they come. Not a mark. Names. If they can't write them, set a boy with a good hand to sit and write them for them while they watch. Men are shy of a boy seeing them lie. They'll lie to a lord without a blink." And around. Old Walena did not speak until the others had finished, and then her words came like a stick drawn along fence slats, slow and even, and not to be hurried. "There's a barrel that sweats in the north store," she said. "It's not the barrel. It's the stone behind it. It weeps when the wind is from the sea. Shift the barrel. If the steward says he cannot, tell him I have done it with worse bones." "Meow." Sansa smiled and made marks as they spoke. When she dismissed them, she gave each woman a token. A small thin strip of hammered iron, rough at the edges, with a hole punched through, and a loop of cord. "Clark's irons," she said. "Not for show. If my name makes a man prickly, show him that. If he stays prickly, send for me." The silent sister took her strip of iron without a nod or a sound, and somehow made the little token into something solemn, just by holding it. Sansa had thought once that the sisters were frightening only because they smelled of winter and knives. She had learned to see the comfort in them. They did their work without hunger. By the second hour, the stew was at a thick, faithful bubble, and the world smelled of cabbage and bacon ends, of wet wool and men getting through their anger to their employment. Simon Templeton brought her a letter from Gulltown. The seal yellowed, and the cut crisp. Sansa broke it by the brazier and read, while Simon watched the way a man watches a table of dice, for the first clue of how the throw has gone. Lord Grafton's hand was neat and dry. He hoped the Vale found itself in health. He had heard disturbing rumors. He stood ever ready to defend the warden's ancient charge of the East. He did not say by whose gift or to provision it cost the gates with barley and saltfish, since winter was no season for discord. He trusted the Lady Regent would consider the good of all. He sent, as a token of his goodwill, a purse to be used at her discretion for the poorer households now gathering around the gates against the cold. He named the sum in the tidy line of a lawyer's script. "Generous man," Simon said, when she laid the letter down, "to send a purse to buy our own loyalty. Not our loyalty, Sansa said. The look of it. If we eat bread he paid for, we will owe him the courtesy of being slow to starve him later. Will you eat it? He was teasing her, but it was also a real question. Simon liked to pretend his words were toys until you tried to chew them and found bone underneath. We will take the purse, Sansa said. We will spend it on wood for the poor, not barley. The smoke will show from the city walls, and Lord Grafton will think himself wise without it costing him much. Then we will send him our accounts, neat and precise, and ask him whether he would prefer that we spend his next purse on pitch for the hulls of the fishing boats he likes to boast of, or nails for the gate he likes to be proud of. Mentanawal. Simon's teeth showed. You learned more than songs in King's Landing. I learned how to make men tell me what flattery they like best. Sansa said. If we do it his way, he will tire and grow cross. If we ask him what he wants us to praise, he will choose the praise that suits him and think he chose wisely. Bender Row. She wrote that letter herself. In the neat hand, her mother had praised, and the court had ruined, and she had sanded back again. She did not mention the purse. She mentioned the smoke from the poor men's chimneys, and how pretty it looked rising straight in the still air, as a sign that the worst winds had passed, for now. She asked Lord Grafton in a postscript whether his men at the harbor had yet seen the early ice, and whether salt worked slower in it, and whether those who salted fish had found better success layering with pine shavings than with straw. Questions made men generous when praise did not. By midday, the first of the tally sticks came back from the north store with damp at one end, and Walena's mark at the top, and a new mark of Sansa's clerk's iron on the cord. By mid-afternoon, the damp barrel was shifted, and the steward came to her with shoulders like a boy's caught in a small lie, and told her that of course he had been intending to move it. But the men, she put her hand on his sleeve and told him that if he needed 3 men instead of 2, he was to say so, and if he feared they would not come, he was to say so more loudly. He went away straighter, which was all she had meant to buy with the touch. Maya Stone came in with snow, melting from her boots in clean shapes on the flags, and said, "The winch told a story this morning I didn't like. Too much strain and the wrong kind. The rope will hold, but the pins want oil, and there's a catch in the wheel that a thumb and a curse won't fix. I'll need to take the wheel off and bring it to where the iron's warm." Then? How long will it be off? Longer than you'll like, Maya said bluntly. Long enough to sour a lord. Then we will sour him with bread in a place by the fire, Sansa said. Move your men when the light is best for seeing what you are doing. If any man complains in a way that makes your work slower, I will put him at the wheel to watch you and learn to be useful. If he learns, I'll keep him. If he doesn't, I'll send him to Nestor to lift sacks until his arms are good for something. Then the tower. Maya looked as pleased as she allowed herself to look. You do know how to move a wheel, she said. And a man. By happenstance, or because the gods like to test flattery, the wheel showed its malice an hour before dusk, while Maya's men were loosening it. The axle squealed and then bit, and the worst of winter winds came shouldering down the mountain at once, turning the descent ramp into a white suggestion. A mule team on the lower platform panicked. Sansa heard the cry come up the shaft, a sound like a rope crying high and human and thin. Maya was already running. Sansa ran after. The winch room at the Gates of the Moon was well built. Good stone, good floor, good sense. But men were men, and even good rooms become cramped when the air is full of fear. Maya's foreman, a man called Harp, with a scar like a stitched seam across his nose, had his hands on 2 younger men and was telling them with inventive obscenity to breathe and remember which way the wheel turned to slacken. And the wheel itself made a kind of speaking noise Sansa had never heard from a thing and did not care to hear again. Cut the load, Maya said, low and sane. You. Harp, knife to the edge. Now, now. If we cut the load, we lose the mule team, one of the boys said, eyes gone milk white around the dark center. My brother. The mule team is already lost, Maya said, and it was not cruelty, it was stone. Cut. Sansa. She did not say my lady. She said the name clean as a tool. "Stand clear." "Cut," Sansa echoed. She did not shout it. She put her mouth near the boy's ear and put her palm to the back of his neck and felt how cold and how hot the skin was. "Cut, and then put your hands where Maya tells you. If your brother is on the line, the kindest thing you'll do for him now is save the next men." "Men." The boy made the small noise that boys make when they become men in a way they will later pretend not to remember. He cut. The rope snapped back like a snake, and the wheel spun and then caught, and the shock went through the stone and up into Sansa's knees and teeth, and there was a distant sound like something heavy making peace with falling. The boys both wept, silent tears that ran and ran. Maya's hand was already on the wheel, soothing it not with words but with weight, the way a rider speaks to a horse. Harp's knife was back in its sheath, and his other hand was on the boy's shoulder that Sansa's hand had left. The same spot, the same weight, the same purpose. When the rest was done, when the wheel was off and the axle freed, and the worst of the wind had gone tearing out across the valley to chew on someone else's house, Sansa went to the lower yard to see the men who had been on the platform. She did not let anyone stop her. She needed to see the place where the rope had reared and snapped and died. She needed to look at the marks the rope had left on the stone. She needed to stand where men had stood and see what they would see next time. So she could. The platform stank of old fear and new cold. A single glove lay with the fingers splayed as if it still held a hand. Sansa bent and picked it up and tucked it into her cloak. She did not know whose it had been. Someone would come ask later. She would give it back then. When she climbed back, Maya was waiting with oil on her hands and a set to her jaw that Sansa recognized from mirrors she had grown into. "You said the right thing," Maya said, which was a rare gift, so rare Sansa felt it sit in her mouth like hot bread. "I said what would make the boy move," Sansa replied. "Tomorrow I'll say something else to make him sleep." She paused. Who was on the platform? 2 mule men and a clan scout, Maya said. The mule men were smart enough to jump. The scout likely was smarter and jumped earlier. "We'll pay the men's widows. The clan will want iron. We'll pay them with an edge. They like edges in winter. It makes them feel rich." "Ben?" "Send word," Sansa said. "The chieftain with the wife who likes numbers will get their own iron, and 1 extra strip for the wife, with a hole punched in it for a cord." Maya's mouth did a thing that was not a smile and not a smile. "She'll show it to the other women in her camp," she said. "They'll remember." The council that evening was more subdued than such councils usually were. Men were grave because fear had been close, and because fear had been answered with something like competence, and not with prayer. Bronzion did not mention the wheel. He spoke instead of a messenger from Redfort, bringing word that the little godswood there had put up a screen of pine boughs to shelter supplicants from the wind, and that the first of the clan envoys had come to the old tree with gifts wrapped in leather. Bone feathers, a little pouch of salt. "They're watching," Jan said, beard tipped with frost he had not bothered to melt before sitting. "You've paid them to watch. They expect to be paid for seeing what they see. Now, they will be paid in iron and in the right to trade within sight of the bloody gate for salt and oil," Sansa said. "They will not be paid to bring us stolen goods. If they do, they will watch us take the goods and burn them so everyone sees. Simon, write that in a letter to be read aloud to their chieftains, and add that the women who bring the trade will be given a place by the fire before the men. I want the men to decide to bring women. I want the men to decide to bring women." Simon's eyebrows went up, pleased. "You would have been a very fine smuggler," he murmured. "It's a pity." "Maybe another winter," Sansa said, and the laughter that ran around the table then was grateful and quick and human. A boy from the guard brought a letter with no seal and a hand so deliberately anonymous that it came around to being a signature. Sansa broke it. A few men leaned in despite themselves. The letter was not long. "My lady Sansa, you speak plain, and we have caught a man who does not. He wears a cloak without a badge. He sells barley from barrels marked with a gull in flight and says the gull is a goose. He says a wheel eats ropes and a mouse eats sacks. He says many things. We were not sure if you wanted such men stacked by the gate or given warm seats. We send him in a cart with a guard, who is stupid in any weather. Sansa passed the letter to Nestor, whose mouth flattened not with anger. He was slow to anger, but with the weight of having seen this so many times that the bones of it had worn through the skin. Bring the man to the small hall, she said. Not the high hall. We'll see him with bread in reach and a stove at his back, and the silent sister in her veil, where he can see it if he chooses. Men who lie for a living pretend not to be afraid of death. Fear of shame is cheaper, and it spends better at the start. Now, the man with the gull barrels came wrapped in false innocence and real cold. He was one of those faces that men were meant to trust. All soft cheeks and sandy hair, and eyes that seemed to have been washed clean of intent. His hands were rough in the right places. He named himself Hutton. He sat with his back to the stove and looked grateful from behind the gratefulness. Sansa did not sit on the chair that lifted her above him. She sat on the same bench, a little away, as if she had something else to do with her hands besides point. Who taught you to mark a gull as a goose? She asked, not sharply, not softly. He blinked at her as if she were a light snow that had surprised him. My lady, you tell the gate you bring goose, she said. In winter, there are more men who know gulls. A gull on a barrel says Gulltown. Men like to argue with a gull. A goose feels homey. It gives the tongue a softer place to go. Who taught you that? It's a good trick. Bow. He swallowed. Men's tricks carry pride with them. If you praise the trick, the pride rises to accept it even when fear pulls it back. My da, he said. Then, more quickly, he's dead. Mine too, Sansa said. Colors are a trick as well. You wore a cloak with too clean a brown. A man who has slept with sacks and rope wears his brown rubbed thinnest, where the rope goes and under the shoulder where the sack rides. Your brown is worn at the cuff. That's a court man's wear. A man who writes sometimes. His mouth did something he probably thought was a smile. You've a clever eye, my lady. I do, she said. I learned it from a man I mean to see hanged. She let that sit then, and took a piece of bread from the board and tore it, and dipped it in the stew, and ate. She gave him the rest. He ate quickly, hunched but tidily, and drank the small ale, and set the cup down where it would not be knocked by someone else's elbow. He had eaten at other men's tables. Who sent you? She asked, when the bent of his shoulders had eased by one line. Say it, and you'll go out by the door. Don't say it, and you'll go out where the snow is deeper. Dan? He stared at the bread in his hand, as if the next bite might have words stitched into the crumb. Gulltown's hungry, he said, as if that were an answer. So are we, Sansa said. But our hunger doesn't send barrels up in the names of birds that won't fly this winter. She leaned closer, so the smell of her breath, stew and pine smoke, nothing sweet, would be what he knew of her. Say his name and I'll send you back with a letter that calls you a fool, and me a fool and him, a prince among fools who will be forgiven if he sells me salt at a better price than yesterday. Men in cities like to read letters that say such things. The letter will be copied at the gate where every clerk can see it. He'll have to treat with me then, or lose face to the men who watch him read. He understood then that this was not a trap of knives. It was a trap of mirrors. Men like him disliked knives because blood tells others a story at once. They disliked mirrors because mirrors told them a story about themselves. He said the name, not loud, and he watched her eyes while he said it, and she kept her eyes clean. She did not flinch. She only said, "Bring me Simon," and then to Hutton, "He ate the rest of your bread. Take off your too clean cloak and give it to the guard who brought you. Go back in his. It smells of horse. Men who do not write will speak to you more freely if you smell of horse." When the man had gone, Simon came with a pen and delight dancing in his fingers. "A letter that calls us fools," he said happily. "And a prince among fools. You do like your toys." "I like to play with what men already carry," Sansa said. "They bring pride and hunger and fear to my hall. I give each a chair. They can be made to bump each other until one sits quiet." The trial of Petyr Baelish did not begin at once. The council agreed to set it on a day when the passes were likely to be open enough for those who wished to attend to come and be seen attending. Appearances were not justice, but they stood in for it when winter made true consensus hard. In the meantime, Petyr sent letters. He sent them to men who liked to be flattered, and to women who disliked to be forgotten, and to priests who loved the sound of their own prayers, and to smiths who loved the sound of silver. He sent one to Sansa, polite as a handkerchief, which she read and then read aloud to the council, and then folded neatly and put back into the purse in which it had come. It said very small things very carefully: that he missed the taste of good wine, that a man should not be judged by the way others misremember him, that he had thought well of Sansa and found himself wounded by her roughness. It wished the boy good health in a line that made Maester Coleman's mouth go flat. Nestor's advice was to burn the letter and forget it. Bronze Yohn's was to nail it to the gate for the stable boys to spit at. Lady Anya said to copy it and send it to Lord Grafton with a question: whether such prose deserved a reply with fish or with iron. Send it to the Silent Sisters, Sansa said, surprising even herself. Ask them to lay it with their dead for one night. If it comes back smelling of flowers in winter, we'll know the gods are listening to Petyr now. If it comes back smelling like ink and old parchment, we will know he is speaking only to himself. Now, they laughed, but the letter went with the sisters, and when it came back it smelled like ink and old parchment, and Sansa found that she had wanted that small foolishness to be true more than she had thought. She put the letter away and did not touch it again. Harold Harding lived loudly. His boots clipped the corridors and his laughter made the tapestries think themselves less threadbare. He wore a glove that was too new and tried to teach the boy how to hold a falcon, and did not show disappointment when the boy's hand shook. This counted for him. He sat with Bronze Yohn and listened more than he boasted. This counted more. He watched Sansa with a bright curiosity that he thought he concealed and did not. This did not count at all. Curiosity could be turned to use. She asked him one evening, while the braziers hummed and the stew smelled of thyme, whether he knew how long a man could sit a saddle in winter before his knees lost their breath. "My knees are not talkers," he said, which was a good joke and not an answer. "Mine speak when I let them," Sansa said. "They say a rider who can sit for 5 hours in winter without hating his horse is a rider who will be a man worth hearing in spring. If you want to be loved here, ride with the men who keep the road down to the gate when the wind is wrong. Keep your mouth shut. Bring one man back on your saddle who would not have been brought back otherwise. That will be worth more than any story about a horse only you can ride." He flushed, not with anger, not quite. And then he laughed at himself, which was another thing that counted. He rode the next day. He did not bring a man back on his saddle. He brought a sack of oats that would have gone over a cliff. It was not the same story, but it told the same truth about what he valued when his mouth was wind-chapped and his pride sore. Sansa praised the oats and not the riding, and he looked at her in that curious, thinking way again. And she let him, and did not let it change her count. The Lord's declarant sent for small things and large, ink, witnesses, a clerk who had once kept the books at Hart's home, and who could be made to say whether Lyn Corbray's purse had been heavier in any season. And Sansa kept the pages moving and did not let the rhythm of it make her forget the other rhythms that mattered. Robert's breathing stayed easier. Coleman turned the sweet sleep back to a powder kept in a jar behind a jar behind a jar. Once, at dusk, Sansa found the maester standing in the corridor with his hands inside his sleeves and his eyes on nothing. Not because he had lost the thread, but because he had found it and did not know whether to pull. She stood beside him and said nothing at all. After a time he said, "I should have stood sooner." And she said, "You are standing now." And they both liked this answer better than a sermon. Lyn Corbray drifted through the halls like a bright knife seeking soft fruit. He made a point of being charming to the kitchen girls and cruel to men who thought themselves immune to charm. He twined his arm with Sansa's once, unbidden, and drew it loose again before anyone could object, and said in a voice meant to leave bruises, "You are prettiest when you pretend at hardness, but you have sweetness still. Men will lick it, one after another, until you are clean down to your bone." She looked at him and thought of Lady Forlorn's edge, and of the way Lynn had smiled at the thought of cracking a nut and eating it, and she said, "If I am bone, I will make good broth," and that made him laugh for true, and then he went away as if he had been the one dismissed. A week turned, then another. The wind shifted its mind twice, and the men who watched the road added and subtracted an hour from their counts, depending on what the mountain told their faces. The small godswood at the Red Fort sent a branch of pine with a ribbon tied around it. The sept sent a penny prayer written in a fair hand on cheap parchment. Sansa paid them both, and kept the pine where she could smell it, and the penny prayer where the charm of it would not be lost on those who needed such charms. On a morning that was almost spring in the way that winter sometimes pretends to be generous, the first of the clan chieftains came to the gate with 3 men and a woman and a child, who clutched a stick with numbers cut into it. They were small as men go, and hard, and wearing their wealth in iron at their waists and salt in a pouch and feathers in their hair. The chieftain was called Tig of the Moon Brothers, and he had a scar that cut across his mouth in a way that made his jokes look like threats, and his threats like jokes. He liked to talk, and he liked to laugh at the end of his own sentence. He did both, and then he grew bored with himself, which was when Sansa began to like him. "You ask us to watch the road," Tig said. "The road moves when the mountain sneezes. You ask us to count. We count for ourselves. Mem do anter." "You count well," Sansa said. "Counting for yourself is why you have salt in your pouch and men in your shadow. I mean to buy some of that counting. Not all. What do you pay in?" She slid the little bundle of iron strips across the table. She had had them hammered with a small falcon and a very small feather. The feather was for the boy. The clan men liked things they could lift. The woman at Tig's shoulder, his sister, Sansa guessed, from the way she watched his mouth for words she might wish to take back later, took the strip and turned it and made a soft huff sound of satisfaction. Tig P pretended not to see this, and then could not resist seeing it. "Iron," he said, as if he had expected her to offer pure gold. "You are wise." "I have learned to be," Sansa said. "Bring me news I can use. When a rope frays. When a man who calls a gull a goose comes with barrels. When a pass looks like it will hold one more day, and then no more. And I will pay you in iron and place and heat. When you bring me stolen goods, I will burn them, and pay you with smoke you cannot eat. When one of your men strikes one of mine in greed, I will answer in kind, and then I will shut the gate to you for a season. When one of mine strikes one of yours in pride, I will answer in kind, and then I will send you 2 strips of iron and ask you to let us be fools in our own house and not yours. I am buying eyes, not hands." "Ben?" The child with the number stick looked at Sansa as if she had said something about ghosts. The woman nudged him with her knee to hush. Tig laughed and then remembered not to. "You speak as if you've been doing this since you bled the first time," he said. "How many winters have you counted?" "Fewer than yours," Sansa said. "Enough to have learned the smell of bread when it is stretched too thin and the sound of a rope that is about to lie. Not enough to be bored yet by any of it." Tig liked that. He liked it so much he tried not to show he liked it, which turned into another sound Sansa learned to recognize. The sound of a man liking a woman's mind more than he will say in company. "We will watch," he said. "We will bring you news wrapped in leather, because paper lies. We will trade within sight of your gate. We will keep our knives out unless you ask for them in very plain words. If one of mine steals a sack from your cart, I will take his ear and put it on the cart, and ask you to send the cart on to the man's wife with the ear to remind her she must learn to count better than he did." "Bah!" Sansa did not flinch. "If one of mine takes iron without carrying news, I will take his finger and put it on the table and ask you to send me a boy who can be taught to count without losing his ear. We will both keep the parts we can spare and the parts we cannot." The woman smiled behind her teeth. The child traced his stick. The clan men went out into the cold with iron strips on cords and the right to boast, and Maya came in from the door and said, "You didn't sing them a song." "I sang them a count," Sansa said. They liked the rhythm. When she was alone, in the quiet that comes after a room has been full the way a skin is full of breath, she went to the little godswood inside the gates. It was not much, a stand of oaks and a few black pines and a weirwood that had never been anything but a sapling and did not remember a face. The snow there had collected very evenly, as if some large hand had smoothed it flat to make a bed. She stood with her hands inside her cloak and looked at the sapling and at the small iron plates where men had hung votives with the seven's faces upon them. She did not know whether to speak, not because she doubted the use, but because speech was dear, and she had spent so much of it on men and wheels and ropes and barrels and boys. She was tempted to be selfish with her quiet. She said finally, aloud, "I am counting." And she felt foolish, and then not foolish at all, because the trees do not waste anything, not even foolishness. "I am counting, and I am cutting, and I am being counted and cut. I will try not to count wrong." She put her palm to the sapling's thin bark. It was chill and a little sticky with sap. She took her hand away and licked her finger and tasted resin and winter and something like old smoke, feather. She said, and felt a little ridiculous and smiled anyway. A fire broke in the south store 3 nights later. It ate quietly at first, like a careful guest, and then lifted its head to make a demand. Men ran with buckets and curses. Someone shouted for the Septon, and someone else for the Silent Sisters, because men's mouths go to what they know when they are frightened. Sansa was there quickly enough to see the color of the first smoke. Good, honest brown from old wood, and to smell the sharper bite beneath. Pitch. Pitch. 2 barrels of pitch were stacked behind the turnip bins, because a steward had thought himself tidy. She took a bucket and threw it where the pitch was not, and made the men throw where the pitch was not. So the pitch would have to eat stone to find more to drink. The fire sulked, and then raged, and then, thwarted of a joy it had counted on, died. In the morning, the turnips tasted of smoke. She had them boiled with bacon fat and black pepper, and served to the men who had stood in the doorway and thrown water while the steam burned their lungs. They ate happily, and cursed the pitch with grease on their lips. She had the steward brought before her, and the man came with the look of someone who has practiced being ashamed into a way of dodging its worst. "I thought the pitch would be safest inside, my lady," he said quickly. "Men take pitch from the yard. Fire takes pitch from inside," she said. "I will not put you in the yard. I will put you in the store with the turnips, and you will eat only turnips until I tell you to stop. And then you will tell every man who comes to take a sack from you what pitch tastes like. He will like you for feeding him, and he will tell other men, and you will not put pitch where turnips sleep again." Then he looked at her with blank distress, as if she had struck him, and he had not yet decided whether to be angry or to weep. "My lady, you will keep your place," she said. "Do not make me sorry." He did not. He said, "My lady," again. And then he went to sit with the turnips, and 2 days later he laughed ruefully, and said to Simon that pitch had never tasted so honest. Simon smiled, and told Sansa, and they both took the wind where it offered itself. Letters came from the riverlands that wanted to be songs, and were only histories of small griefs. Bandits, bad roads, a woman's daughter gone to a camp and not returned. Sansa read them and set them aside and wrote to the one with the daughter, and asked her where the girl had last been seen, and whether she had a freckle on the left or the right cheek, and whether her laugh sounded like a goat's. It was a foolish letter to send. She sent it anyway. When the answer came, she read it 3 times, and then put it in the box with the other letters that were not useful and were sacred. On the day the passes held long enough to hope for a crowd, Pettier Baelish was led to the hall with a new smile on his mouth and an old patience in his eyes. The court was full. Men had come to be warmed by the spectacle, and by the braziers both. Sansa took her place not at the high end, but a little off, where she could see both the men and the door. Bronzion had his helm on the bench beside him like a companion who would not leave early. Lady Agnes' ribbon was tucked in like a sword belt. Nestor had 3 sticks of charcoal and a clerk. Simon had chosen a coat with more buttons than necessary, and had buttoned them all. Petyr spoke, and when he spoke the air in the hall grew softer. He knew how to make sound useful. He was reasonable. He was weary. He was loyal to a fault. He was modest about his loyalty, which was a trick of kings. He admitted the little things most men were too proud to admit, and denied the thing proud men deny. He did it well. Sansa did not speak over him. She let him hang his decorations. When Lady Anya asked very carefully if he had ever pushed anyone through any door, he smiled and said, "Only myself into folly, and men who wanted to laugh but did not were pleased with themselves for not laughing. They called Marillion and let him sit in a chair and told him he would not be beaten if he said the wrong word. He believed them just enough to say 3 useful ones, and then he wept, and the sisters stood and made the sign they make for men who are already partly dead. They called Coleman, and he said the numbers again, and did not weep. They called Lothar Brune, and he said nothing at all that could be pinned to a wall, because he was a man built to be a wall himself. They called Maya, and she said only that the wind had been wrong that night, and the tapestries had moved as if something had walked behind them. They called Sansa last, and she said what she had said, and she did not look at Petyr when she said it, because if she looked, he would draw her eyes to the place where his words lived, and that would be a kind of courtesy she could not afford. When it was over, there was a hush like the hush in the winch room. When the wheel had wanted to lie, Bronzion said, "We will speak." And the lords went to a smaller room with a table that smelled of old ink and men's hands. Sansa did not go with them. She stood in the corridor with the tapestries and ran her finger along the edge of the fabric where a thread had come loose, and she thought of the way her mother's hands had felt when they folded a cloth, and of the way her father's hand had felt on the table when he had made a point without making a fist. Lynn Corbray came and leaned beside her and looked at the thread and at her hand. "Do you know the thing I like best about you?" he asked conversationally, like a cat talking to a mouse he did not mean to eat yet. "It is that you have learned to be hard without turning ugly. Most people who learn hardness crack. You haven't, yet. I am still young," she said. "Men have not had time to draw all the lines. Oh, they will." His smile was like the bright edge of a blade in a room where no blades were supposed to be. "They will mark you as if you were a map, and there were lost boys who cannot read the sky. Then I will learn to track," she said, and the oddest expression crossed his face. Almost surprise, almost respect, almost hunger. Bronzion came out with the set of a man who had decided to do something he did not like and would not shirk. Lady Agnes' ribbon might have drooped by a finger width, but if it had, it only made her look more dangerous. Nestor had ink on his thumb. Simon's mouth was clean of any expression that could be accused of being a smile. They stood before the hall and spoke in turn and in sum. The words were old words. They made a new thing. Petyr Baelish was to be held to answer at Gulltown before the eyes of the city he had most carefully courted. A judgment chosen as much for theater as for justice, because theater was a form of justice when men had been persuaded by theater into their sin. In the meantime, he would be confined, not in a cell that would make men pity him, but in a set of rooms with a window looking east, so the dawn could find him whether he liked it or not, and without paper or pen, his words to be spoken and written down by a clerk and read back to him in front of a witness. He was stripped of the style of protector. He was not stripped of life. Winter had no need of martyrs. He bowed to the judgment as if they had kissed him, and Sansa thought she had never seen anything as brave as his bow. It was a bravery that had eaten many men and vomited up gold. She stood very still until he was gone. That night, when the braziers had sunk to their small glows, and the stew-pot had been scraped and set aside, and the wind played in the rafters like an old man working at a simple tune, Sansa sat with Robert and a book of falcons on her knee and a feather in her hair, because he had insisted, solemn and delighted. He touched the feather and told her that feather had been gentle today, The wind had not scolded him when he walked between the braziers. He asked if winter would end when he had enough feathers. "It will end when it ends," she said. "Feather is only feather. The mountain listens to no one. But we can count. And we can cut. And we can sit by the fire and be bored and brave." "I am brave," he said, half asleep. "You are brave," she answered. And when he slept, she sat a while longer and was quiet, and let the tiredness go through her bones and out of them again, as if her bones were a sieve made for such passings. She let herself think of Winterfell, not of songs, not of the colored banners, but of a piece of wood worn smooth where a girl's hand had rested often, and of a boy's laugh in a corridor, and of her mother's breath when she bent to blow a candle, and left the room in the dark on purpose so the girls would speak to each other in whispers and think themselves conspirators. The morning after that, the wind came from the sea with damp in it again, and the snow took on a weight that bent young branches. Sansa walked the stores with Nestor and Walina and the Silent Sister, and made marks and rubbed them out, and made them again. She stood in the yard while Harold Harding came in with a man on his saddle at last, a guard whose knee had gone wrong on the road, and she praised the man and not the rider. She sent Maya to the winch room with hot stones wrapped in cloth for the men's hands. She sat with Simon and wrote 3 letters, and then a 4th that she would not send yet. One to White Harbor again, this time with a question about the price of wool when winter thought itself over, and one to the small sept to ask if any of the orphans had fingers quick enough to learn to tie sacks so that mice would curse, and one to Lord Grafton to ask him whether a small party of men might be let move in the city to take a census of winter kitchens, and the last. She sealed the ones that were meant for other eyes and put the other letter in the coffer with the girl's laugh, and the woman's worry and the man's hand on the table, and the little glove from the platform. She shut the lid and set her palm on it for courage. Wood. She remembered. Gives courage back when you are done. Stone keeps it. She would need both. Outside, Feather pressed his mouth against the corners of the houses and found the chinks. The smoke from the poor men's chimneys rose straight up, a thin praise for fuel well spent. The mountain was not a god. It was a great, indifferent beast that could be harnessed sometimes, and sometimes only endured. Sansa drew in breath until the cold scratched sweet at the back of her throat, and then she went to the hall where men had already begun to bring their small angers and their large griefs. And she set her hands on the wood of the table and felt it solid beneath her and began again.